The following account is compiled from 22 field reports, 7 laboratory analyses, and 1 testimony that was officially denied. The data at the end of this file is the reason I reclassified it. You will understand shortly. Between the Orion and Perseus arms, silence is an absolute physical weight. Listening post Auric 9 sat precisely in the center of an electromagnetic dead zone. It was a sterile titanium cylinder suspended in the deep dark, far from shipping lanes and colonial traffic. For crew members staffed the station, their primary directive was to monitor the void for deep space anomalies, distress beacons, or undocumented stellar phenomena. It was tedious, unglamorous work. Corveth Don was an unranked audio technician. He was a Minvari. His species possessed slender frames, pale white skin, and large, deeply cupped ears that instinctively oriented toward the slightest vibration. Minvari biology was built entirely around auditory processing. They could perceive frequencies and acoustic structures that other species required complex machinery to detect. This made them exceptional analysts, though Don himself was merely a civilian contractor. He had not yet earned the title of senior decoder. He was just a listener working the graveyard shift, tasked with filtering out the cosmic junk that no official scientist wanted to spend time reviewing. A low static hiss. That was the sound of his console booting up for the start of his shift. Don adjusted the haptic interface dials. The ambient temperature of the listening chamber was kept low to prevent the computing cores from overheating. He could feel the cold radiating through the floor plating, traveling up his legs. He pulled up his cue for the cycle. The roster was filled with automated flags generated by the station's massive external sensor arrays. Most of these flags were routine anomalies, microscopic fluctuations in the interstellar medium that required a technician's signature before being permanently archived and forgotten. Item 4 on the list was a data file designated Anomaly 7741. Don routed the file to his primary screen. The metadata tag appended by the automated system read, Persistent noise anomaly, catalogued, dismissed. A secondary note from a previous analyst simply labeled it as natural interference. It was a classification that had remained unchanged for generations. Anomaly 7741 was a persistent, low-frequency pattern embedded in the galactic microwave background. Every monitoring station across the known universe recorded it. Every auditory species heard it. Every scientific body classified it as the random, decaying hum of the universe itself. It was the background radiation left over from the formation of the cosmos. For over 2 billion years, nobody had bothered to look twice at the noise. It was simply the sound the void made. He highlighted the file, preparing to apply the standard dismissal code and move on to the next item in the endless queue. Bureau Director Thessan Vorik stepped into the listening chamber. Vorik was a Thessari. The insectoid director possessed 6 arms, compound eyes, and a profound lack of patience for deviations from protocol. His mandibles clicked softly in the cold air of the room as he approached Don's workstation. Vorik did not typically oversee the graveyard shifts, but the Galactic Signal Monitoring Bureau had recently issued a sweeping directive. "You have not applied the patch," Vorik stated. His voice a dry rasp that bypassed Don's auditory canals and vibrated directly against his jawbone. "I am working through the preliminary queue, Director," Don replied, his large ears twitching slightly to orient toward the Thessari. Anomaly 7741 is cosmic background radiation. It has been verified by 3,000 separate installations. The Bureau requires the software update applied to all archival static, Vorik said. No exceptions for previously classified files. Execute the methodology upgrade. Don suppressed a sigh. The Bureau had recently distributed a new algorithmic filter. It was a base 10 mathematical lens designed to re-examine ancient data for structural anomalies that older computing models might have missed. Applying a base 10 structural lens to the galactic microwave background was an exercise in pure bureaucratic redundancy. The microwave background was the thermal radiation left over from the time of recombination. It was chaotic, unstructured, and entirely devoid of mathematical intent. He initiated the sequence anyway. The software patch engaged. The primary monitor flickered as the algorithms began stripping away the upper layers of cosmic dust. Don watched the visual representation of the background radiation cascade across the screen. It looked like a violent storm of green and gray pixels, a visual representation of absolute thermodynamic chaos. He routed the audio feed to his headset. The sound was a dense, overlapping roar of stellar winds, distant pulsar rotations, and the baseline hum of the galaxy. It was a noise Don had heard every single day of his 11-year career. It was the sound of empty space. He applied the base 10 filter to the audio stream. The roar fractured. The software isolated a specific frequency band hidden deep beneath the surface layers of the microwave background. Don leaned forward in his chair. The chaotic noise thinned out, stripping away the static of dying stars and rogue planetary bodies. He adjusted his biological auditory focus. The muscles around his cupped ears contracted, allowing him to separate the newly isolated band from the residual noise. The sound was a rapid, high-pitched flutter, which meant the base 10 filter had found a mathematical structure. Don stared at the haptic interface. The visual waveform on his screen was no longer a chaotic scramble of pixels. It was an incredibly tight, compressed band of repeating peaks and valleys. It made no sense. It did not match any known geological or stellar profile. Pulsars possessed repeating structures, but their frequencies were broad and easily identifiable. This was something entirely different. He applied a temporal dilation sequence. If the sound was compressed, it needed to be stretched to be properly perceived by biological processing speeds. He adjusted the dilation parameters, instructing the central computing core to slow the isolated audio track down by a factor of exactly 4,600. The result was immediate. Filter applied. Base 10 metric. Reduction factor 4,600. Result confirmed. The rapid flutter vanished entirely. In its place, a heavy, rhythmic pulse began to play through the acoustic dampeners of his headset. It was a low, resonant thud. A pause. Another thud. A distinct pause. A repeating cycle. Don pulled the headset away from his ears. He let it rest around his neck. He checked the diagnostic readouts, suspecting a hardware malfunction in the audio routing system. The station's dampeners were functioning perfectly. The processing cores were operating within optimal thermal ranges. The software was executing exactly as programmed. He put the headset back on. The rhythm continued. It lacked the erratic decay of a dying star or the rigid, unyielding mathematics of a mechanical distress beacon. It possessed a deliberate, sustained cadence. It was organic in its slight imperfections, yet perfectly consistent in its overall timing. Don engaged the station's main auditory broadcast system. He routed the decoded signal from his private console to the overhead speakers in the main control room. When Don first isolated the rhythm and played it through the station's audio system, the 4 staff members fell silent, not from fear. There was something in the rhythm, a steadiness, a warmth, that felt like being held. Junior analyst Pemith later described it as the sound of someone telling you everything would be all right. She could not explain why a decoded cosmic signal made her feel safe. 72 beats per minute matches one thing: a resting cardiac rhythm, a heartbeat. Don felt his own pulse accelerate, a rapid, panicked flutter in his chest that completely clashed with the deep, steady rhythm playing through the overhead speakers. He opened the biological rhythm databases. He commanded the system to cross-reference the exact acoustic structure, the pressure differential, and the specific spacing of the systolic and diastolic phases. The database confirmed his suspicion. It was a flawless acoustic representation of a biological heart. Someone had synthesized the exact sound of a beating heart and buried it beneath the background radiation of the universe. Vorik moved closer to the console. His lower forearms dropped loosely to his sides. "Run an origin trace," the Thessari director ordered. "Find the transmission source. To trace a signal, an analyst must find the point of highest intensity and track the degradation outward. It is a fundamental law of physics that a broadcast loses cohesion the further it travels from its source." Don initiated the triangulation protocols. He expected the computer to point toward a specific coordinate in the Perseus arm, or perhaps an uncharted system in the dense galactic halo. He waited for the parallax calculations to process across the sector grid. The triangulation sequence failed. Don cleared the cache and ran it again. He adjusted the sensitivity parameters. He widened the search grid to encompass the entire local cluster, utilizing the external sensor arrays of 3 neighboring relay stations to create a massive virtual listening dish. The result was identical. The computer returned an error state. "There is no origin point," Don said, his voice barely audible over the steady thud of the heartbeat echoing through the chamber. "Equipment failure," Vorik stated, though his mandibles were twitching erratically. "The equipment is functioning perfectly," Don replied. He pointed to the visual representation of the sensor grid. "The signal is omnidirectional. It isn't coming from a specific star system. It isn't a tight beam transmission. It is embedded in the background radiation itself. It is woven into the electromagnetic fabric of the galaxy. It is coming from everywhere simultaneously. To embed a sound into the void itself required impossible engineering. It required technology that no current civilization possessed or even theoretically understood. You would have to manipulate the foundational energy of the universe, altering the baseline frequency of spacetime to carry the acoustic data. Don ran a radiometric degradation analysis. He needed to know how long the signal had been actively broadcasting. Even the most powerful transmissions eventually lose coherence, scattered by cosmic dust, gravitational lensing, and the sheer expansion of the universe. By measuring the absolute lack of structural decay in the heartbeat, he could calculate its precise age. The diagnostic took 4 minutes to complete. The central core utilized every available processing thread. The number appeared on the main screen in stark white text. 4.6 billion standard years. Impossible. Don stared at the readout. His chromatophores, usually a calm, pale white, flushed with a deep, bruised violet. The physical sensation of cognitive dissonance settled heavily in his chest, making it difficult to breathe. 4.6 billion years ago, the galaxy was a volatile cauldron of forming stars and toxic nebulas. There were no charted civilizations. There were no established hyperlanes. There was no infrastructure capable of broadcasting anything, let alone a localized biological rhythm on a universal scale. I paused the recording here. I needed a moment before continuing. Archive File 001 documented a biological anomaly on KV-7731. This file documents something far more pervasive. A signal that was there before KV-7731 even formed. The data file Don had originally opened, the one tagged as natural interference, was not static. It was a deliberate message. It had been playing while entire empires rose, expanded, and collapsed into dust. It was the oldest sound in the universe. Don watched the waveform pulse on the monitor. 72 beats per minute. The pattern was forming, but the identity of the broadcaster remained hidden behind a veil of incomprehensible scale. He looked up at the insectoid director. Vorik was staring at the screen, his compound eyes reflecting the brilliant green line of the waveform. The galaxy had never been quiet. The background hum of the cosmos was a broadcast, and they were finally listening. Don's hands moved across the haptic interface with a frantic clumsiness entirely uncharacteristic of a Minvari. A localized acoustic phenomenon could easily be dismissed as a sensor glitch or a microscopic fracture in the station's hull. A station-wide error could be diagnosed as a cascading software failure within the local processing core. But a galaxy-wide signal required independent confirmation from entirely separate hardware architectures operating under completely different physical conditions. He routed a priority encrypted ping to 3 distinct listening posts scattered across the furthest reaches of the galactic map. He selected Outpost Kalen, suspended in the freezing, lightless void of the outer rim where the ambient temperature approached absolute zero. He selected Relay Station Vex, a heavily shielded facility positioned dangerously close to the dense, chaotic radiation storms of the galactic core. Finally, he targeted Orbital Platform 4, an automated buoy hovering directly above a violent neutron star in the Sagittarius arm. If the signal was truly universal, it would exist in all 3 extreme environments simultaneously. The wait was agonizing. Vorik stood perfectly still behind the console. The Thessari director did not speak. His compound eyes remained fixed on the green waveform traversing the primary monitor. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic clicking of Vorik's mandibles against his palps. It was a nervous biological habit, one Don had never actually witnessed the stoic director perform before. 3 standard minutes felt like a tectonic shift in geological time. Then the responses arrived in a synchronized cascade of data packets. Confirmed. The readout appeared on the central monitor in stark white text. Outpost Kalen reported the identical waveform piercing cleanly through the outer rim interference. Relay Station Vex successfully isolated the exact same frequency hidden beneath the overwhelming core radiation. Orbital Platform 4 confirmed the temporal compression ratio without a single structural deviation. The signal was not a local artifact. It was woven into the fundamental fabric of the cosmos. "It is everywhere," Don said. His voice sounded thin and distant in the cold room. He opened the biological rhythm database again. The parameters needed to be ruthlessly narrowed to find a precise match. He initiated a deep archive search for carbon-based and silicon-based lifeforms possessing a resting cardiac rhythm between 60 and 100 beats per minute. The station's central processor spun up to maximum thermal capacity. The cooling systems whined in protest as the central core searched through petabytes of anatomical history. Don watched the numbers flicker. He felt a strange sense of reverence. He was sorting through the biological blueprints of the universe to find the architect of its background noise. The system processed the immense request, pulling anatomical data from thousands of documented worlds across every known sector. 214 species qualified. Filter by exact match, Vorik commanded. 72.0 average. Don adjusted the haptic slider. The long list of alien species collapsed instantly. 3 candidate species remained on the glowing screen. He pulled the evolutionary timelines for all 3. The first candidate was an aquatic species from the inner rim. Their evolutionary record traced back a mere 70 million years. Don deleted their profile from the screen. The second candidate was a subterranean silicon network. Their origin point was calculated at just under 1 billion years. He deleted them as well, which left a single remaining file. The sheer scale of the discovery began to crush the ambient air out of the room. Don looked at the numbers and felt a profound, isolating chill settle over his pale Minvari skin. The signal permeates every cubic light-year of the Milky Way. Every species that ever lived has heard it. None of them recognized it. It is the sound of a single heart beating across 100,000 light-years for 4.6 billion years without pause. Vorik leaned heavily forward. His compound eyes reflected the single remaining species profile glowing in the dark chamber. Species candidate Homo sapiens. Earth, Don read aloud. The biological classification data scrolled continuously across the secondary monitor. It detailed a bipedal, carbon-based mammalian species inhabiting a solitary blue planet in an unremarkable outer spiral. They were officially classified as a remarkably young civilization. They had barely achieved local system travel. Their technological footprint was negligible. Their biological profile was utterly unremarkable compared to the resilient flora of the core worlds or the crystalline entities of the outer rim. Yet their average resting cardiac rhythm was precisely 72 beats per minute. The waveform displayed on Don's primary monitor matched their galactic background noise with a 0.0% deviation. The galaxy's oldest background radiation was a human heartbeat. Someone wanted to make sure the galaxy was never truly silent. The implications struck Director Vorik with tangible physical force. His lower forearms dropped loosely to his sides, completely abandoning his posture of command. His mandibles twitched in an involuntary display of severe neurological stress. He realized immediately what this meant for the Galactic Signal Monitoring Bureau. He realized what it meant for the entirety of known science. Every navigational constant, Vorik whispered. Don nodded slowly. His pale skin remained flushed with dark violet, betraying his internal panic. Every astronomical measurement they possessed was fundamentally compromised. Every hyperlane calculation and every piece of deep space telemetry relied on the absolute assumption that the galactic microwave background was natural. Deep space navigation used that background hum as a static map, a fixed reference point to calculate slipspace trajectories. Ships calibrated their hyperspace drives against the constant noise of the universe. If it was artificial, if it was an engineered broadcast, then the map was alive. The foundational zero point of all physical science was a manufactured pulse. Every textbook was wrong. Every calculation contained a hidden variable. They had been navigating the stars using a message they never knew was there. "Shut it down," Vorik ordered. Don looked up. "Sir, I am ordering an immediate freeze on all active signal research across this sector," Vorik said. His voice lacked its usual commanding edge. It sounded hollow and drained of authority. "We cannot process any new data. We cannot verify any new anomalies. Not when the baseline itself is corrupted. Send the freeze command to the secondary relays." Don typed the strict override commands to suspend the station's primary monitoring loops. The automated cues paused. The red lights above the diagnostic panels turned amber. He watched the data cascade down the glass. He realized that every chart and every map they had ever used to navigate the dark spaces between the stars was built on a foundation of artificial noise. The cost of this truth was the immediate collapse of their entire scientific framework. Don felt a profound sense of loss. He had spent 11 years cataloging the sounds of the universe, only to learn he had been listening to a single ancient song the entire time. Their entire understanding of the universe had been a misunderstanding of a single biological signature. Don bypassed the Bureau's internal chain of command completely. He packaged the isolated waveform, the base 10 filtration sequence, and the temporal dilation algorithm into a heavily encrypted data packet. He attached the precise evolutionary timeline matches. He routed the massive file directly to the scientific liaison office stationed on Earth. Then he waited. The listening post felt entirely different now. The isolation of Auric 9 was absolute. Don sat at his console while the station's external sensors remained locked in their amber standby modes. He did not monitor the active distress channels. He did not log the shifting stellar winds. He simply watched the green line of the isolated heartbeat pulse across his screen. 9 standard cycles passed in complete silence. Don slept in his chair. He consumed minimal nutrient rations from the automated dispenser, barely tasting the synthesized proteins. He found himself subconsciously timing his own breathing to match the 72 beats per minute pulsing on the monitor. It was a hypnotic, deeply grounding rhythm. It felt less like a scientific anomaly and more like a tether holding him to reality. The rest of the station staff avoided the control room, unnerved by the constant, heavy thud playing over the speakers. A sharp chime pierced the quiet. On the 9th cycle, a single inbound transmission triggered the proximity alert. Don activated the decryption protocol with trembling fingers. He expected a massive data package in return. He expected frantic scientific inquiries, demands for raw sensor telemetry, or perhaps a panic denial from the Earth authorities. He braced himself for a flurry of bureaucratic demands. The decryption sequence finished. A plain text string appeared in the center of the primary monitor. For words. "We know. We listen." Don stared at the text. He sent an immediate follow-up request. He asked for clarification on the origin point. He asked for the exact coordinates of the broadcast mechanism. The transmission bounced back instantly. The Earth liaison channel had been securely closed. They were not offering explanations. They were simply acknowledging the sound, which meant they possessed no mechanism to share or no desire to explain it. Don pulled up a blank diagnostic screen and began running theoretical energy calculations. He needed to understand the physical mechanics of the broadcast. If the signal was artificial, it required a massive, sustained power source. He input the parameters for a transmission capable of permeating the entire galactic volume simultaneously without structural decay. He asked the computer to calculate the necessary thermal output. The resulting number was staggering. If the signal is artificial, the energy required to sustain it for 4.6 billion years exceeds the total output of 14 billion stars. No machine could generate that. No reactor could contain it. Someone built a broadcast mechanism powered by the galaxy itself. They had wired the entire universe to play their own pulse, utilizing the cosmic web as a resonant amplifier. Don sat alone in the listening chamber. The ambient lighting was dialed down to a faint blue glow. Vorik had returned to his quarters, completely unresponsive since issuing the freeze command. The other two crew members were asleep, entirely unaware that the universe they knew had effectively ended. Don reached up and carefully removed his headset, placing it gently on the cold titanium desk. For the first time in 11 years, his ears were entirely uncovered while on shift. The post should have been completely silent. The acoustic dampeners were fully active. The hull was perfectly insulated against the freezing vacuum of deep space. He should have heard only the faint hum of the environmental scrubbers and his own breathing. Except the silence was a lie. It never was silent. The heartbeat was there. He could feel it now. He could feel the low, steady vibration of it in the floor plating beneath his boots. He could sense it in the dense air of the room. It had been there since before the station was constructed. It had been there since before his ancestors crawled out of the Minvari oceans. It was there before the first star in the Perseus arm ignited into burning life. What he had once dismissed as a nuisance, a layer of static to be filtered out, was now a sacred cadence holding the void together. End of file. End of certainty. The waveform continued its steady march across Don's screen. 72 beats per minute. Steady, patient, endless. The green line flared and dipped, a perfect biological rhythm painted in brilliant light against the dark monitor. Don saw his own reflection in the glass. He saw his pale face and his large ears turned slightly toward the console, listening to a sound that was older than everything. A simple data file, initially dismissed as natural cosmic interference, had rewritten the absolute architecture of reality. Whose heart? And if it's been beating for 4.6 billion years, is it still alive? Or is this what a species sounds like when it refuses to be forgotten?